Thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Hensch. It was a wonderful day so far, and it's always wonderful to see Professor Satori's talk and kind of to share the stage. So the things I'll talk about will, I think, overlap a lot with what Dr. Satori already mentioned, but maybe also hopefully give us a little bit more insight into what we could do about leveraging the effect of music on pleasure and the dopaminergic system and the reward system for brain health more specifically. So we know that music is important in every human society. Every human culture has evidence of music making and music enjoyment. Music is used for expressing passion in all cultures that have been studied, and also for intergenerational bonding in all cultures that have been studied. And I don't even need to tell you to go bop and rock out to a concert. You just do it, right? Because you want to, right? So there's something very implicit about our musical knowledge that seems to be ingrained in us as humans. And you might think music is a uniquely human skill, but it turns out that there's this parrot called Snowball, this cockatoo, very famous for dancing in time to Backstreet Boys, Backstreet's Back All Right. And if you speed up the Backstreet Boys, it actually speeds up its dancing. If you slow down the Backstreet Boys, it slows down its dancing. So it's not just imitating, right? It's actually phase locking. And then since then, they've enumerated the different kinds of dance moves. It's got 14 different categories of dance moves, which is 13 more than I've got. Now, the relationship between music and health is not new. In fact, it's been thought about since antiquity. In fact, the ancient Greek god Apollo of medicine is also the ancient Greek god of music. And more recently, there's been a sort of renaissance in this country in how we think about music as a form of medicine, right? In fact, the National Institute of Health is now very interested in the relationship between sound and health. And so in the first approximation, this is a kind of overview article that I co-authored with Dr. Satori and some of the program officers from the National Institute of Health. And we think about music as including but not limited to components such as melody and harmony and rhythm. And then also, that can then engage, be used for various kinds of music-based interventions, which include receptive types of music interventions, so music listening, mindful meditation during listening, as well as active music-based interventions that include maybe dance and composing music, making music, which in turn might then leverage the brain circuitry, including but not limited to the auditory system and other areas of the brain downstream that together might give rise to improved health and well-being. So the idea of music being useful for cognitive and brain health and well-being is not new, but we also have thought about why music exists in the first place, right? And this is kind of a field-wide overview of the different kinds of musical stimuli and musical components that might be leveraged to tap into this prediction and reward system that you've already heard a little bit about, with the idea that the ultimate goal, right, there are different levels of analysis here, but the ultimate goal of music is to bring people together, is to enhance social bonding. And so that might include intergenerational bonds, right, like the maternal singing to the infants, or it might include group membership cues, right? We use music to move together as work music, right? And it might also include enhanced within group bonds. So my lab in the past couple of years has been focusing on the more proximal side of this, the underlying neurobiology of why and how music brings us together. And I think the short story, as you heard Professor Satori mention before me, has something to do with prediction and its engagement of the reward system that includes the dopaminergic system in the brain. So I know you've all had a little bit of caffeine, or hopefully you're feeling engaged enough to indulge me in this task. You seem like a very, very polite crowd. So if you can indulge me in doing exactly this task that my former student Anna Kroedinger did with people who were before and after dance intervention for people with Parkinson's disease. All right, so I'm going to play you a short clip of music, and I'd like you to put your fingers to your thumb and tap in rhythm to the music. Okay? Be nice and polite. This is very helpful. Thank you. You keep doing what you're doing. You're doing the right thing.
Very superstitious.
Oh, all right. Well, thank you. So I didn't tell you to move your necks, but I was watching the crowd, and you were very polite in tapping your fingers to your thumbs, and then when the rhythm guitar comes in, you couldn't seem to help it. There was this voluntary movement of additional motor effectors that seem to kick in, and then when this voice comes in, and then I abruptly stop the voice, and there's this collective gasp of like, but it was going so well. But it turns out if I played the whole song, then I don't have time to give my talk. But suffice it to say that there's something about moving to music that seems to be intrinsic, right? That seems to be very easy. So that was Stevie Wonder's Superstition, one of the grooviest songs of all time. And that was one of the pieces that Anna Kroedinger used to assess sensory motor coupling in people with Parkinson's disease. So there's this wonderful program called Dance for PD that is offered in 45 different sites around the world. And what Anna did was measure Parkinsonian symptoms as identified using the gold standard neuropsychological scale called the Unified Parkinson's Disease Rating Scale, UPDRS, to quantify the number of different Parkinsonian symptoms that these patients had before and after 4 months of dance intervention. And what she saw firstly was that after 4 months of dance intervention, there was a reduction in overall symptoms as quantified by this UPDRS. And it turns out that the symptom reduction was not limited to motor symptoms, but also to motivational symptoms. So Parkinson patients often have additional symptoms, including depression and motivational issues, and those seem to be reduced as well over time. But what we think that tapping to rhythm gets into, right, is a way of quantifying the coupling, intrinsic coupling between the sensory system, the auditory system, and the motor system, right, which you use for tapping. And so we quantified the tapping as inter-tap intervals in different Parkinsonian patients, and you can see how there are different songs, some of which are very groovy, right? So Superstition is one of the most famous high groove songs, some of which are more low groove, so less tappable, but more chill, but still very enjoyable. So songs like What a Wonderful World. You don't tend to tap to that as much, but it's still very enjoyable, right? And so we had different participants tap in time to music, and you can see that each song has a very specific intrinsic tapping rate. But then if you focus on some of the participants, what we saw was that before and after this 4-month dance intervention, after the intervention, there was a reduction in the randomness, right, or the entropy, the reduction in the randomness, or kind of increase in the precision of this tapping after the intervention. And in fact, if you quantify this precision of tapping using entropy, that turns out to be predictive of the change in the reduction in symptomology. So the people who were better tappers turned out to improve more from that intervention. Suggesting that there's something about tapping which really gets at how well connected the sensory motor system is. And of course, tapping to music is one way of showing that you can enjoy music, but you also enjoy music without necessarily moving to it, right? So even if you're not overtly moving in time to music, your brain is still nodding in time or coupled in time to the rhythmic content of music. This is one study we published recently where we looked at electroencephalography, so brain potentials that are very time-sensitive measure of how the brain can change and neuronal dynamics might change in time to music. And what we did was we had people listen, older and younger adults listen to self-selected pieces of music. Now, as we showed before, music can unfold in many, many different time scales and many, many different rhythms. And what we had to do was ask them to tap in time to the rhythm before we recorded this EEG. And so that gives us a good sense of what exactly they thought of as their pulse in listening to this music. And what we saw was that there's significant phase locking in both younger and older adults in time to the rhythm of the music, and also to the subdivided levels, beat levels of music, and also to the super divided bar measure levels of music. Right, so there's something about our brain dynamics that seems to be intrinsically coupled in time to the rhythm of the music. And so that gets us from not just moving in time to music, but also being moved by music. Right? So I certainly know that there are some pieces of music that give me chills when I listen to them every time. Maybe there's some pieces of music that do that for you as well. And when we're talking about chills, we're not just saying, it's not just a figure of speech, but it's actually a physiological change. Right? People report feeling that their hearts are racing sometimes, or that their hair is standing on end, or that they're feeling a lump in their throat, or they're losing their sense of time. And so a couple of years ago, we did a first survey study. This is in collaboration with Matthew Sachs, who was my first Harvard undergrad student that ended up doing a dissertation with me. And what he did was he asked a few hundred, mostly Harvard undergrads, when you listen to music, how often do you feel like you're losing sense of time, right? How often do you feel like you're getting chills? How often do you feel like your hair is standing on end, right? And all these different responses. And then he applied what's called multidimensional scaling statistical technique to reduce the dimensionality of these responses into, in this case, a two-dimensional space. And so what that does is the responses that are more frequently co-reported or co-occurring show up as closer together on that space. And what you can see here is that already responses like heart racing, heart skipping a beat, anything that actually pertains to a part of the body, right, feeling like you have a lump in your throat or a pit in your stomach, that shows up on one side of this plot. Whereas anything that's more abstract or maybe even more transcendental, these more abstract feelings like feeling a strong emotional response or losing sense of time, right, that are more, they don't pertain to a part of the body, but are still very intense responses to music, they show up on the other side of the plot. Right, so that event essentially tells us that there are two kinds of responders, some that are more visceral in response to music and some that are more abstract. And so we can quantify these by comparing, we can compare people who tend to report getting lots of chills and strong emotional responses in response to music, and folks who don't, right? There are some folks who don't report getting strong emotions to music despite having similar musical training and similar personality and similar in all ways, but just not tend to get so strong emotions to music. And what we did was we specifically tried to identify, using diffusion magnetic resonance imaging, as Robert just showed you before, white matter connectivity between areas of the brain that are important for auditory perception and areas of the brain that are important for emotion and reward. And to cut a very long story short, what we saw was that people who tend to report getting strong emotions and getting chills all the time in response to music have larger volume in their patterns of white matter connectivity between the areas that are important for auditory perception and areas that are important for social and reward and emotion processing. And so in red, I'm showing you the white matter connectivity that we identified in people who say they get chills all the time. And in blue, I'm showing the same in people who don't get chills all the time. And you can see how there's larger volume in the white matter in the chill perceivers than in the no chill perceivers. So when that result got published, this gentleman got in touch with us. That's the musical anhedonic that Robert already introduced. We'll call him BW. And there was just such an unusual situation. And he said that he doesn't understand why people would like music. He's never enjoyed music. He is not congenitally a music. He understands that the music can be in major or in minor. He can hear the difference between majors and minors. And he knows that major is supposed to be happy and minor is supposed to be sad, but he just never actually felt it. And he would say things, we interviewed him at length, and he would say things like, well, I would be standing in the checkout counter, in line in the drugstore, and other teenagers would be bopping in time to music in their headphones, and I would wonder, why would you want to do that? So that's really, that's a great question. Why do people do that? And so we interviewed him at length, and we also ran the same neuropsychological surveys that Ernesto Mas published along with Dr. Sartori. So this is the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire. And so in red, I'm showing you BW's results, and in the black, we're showing the original report results and our control subjects results, which are of course quite similar, which is nice. But what BW showed was that he was more than 5 standard deviations below the mean in all aspects of musical reward. And so we also ran the physical anhedonia scale. So we asked him questions like, do you enjoy long walks on the beach? Do you enjoy good food? Right? And it turns out he's pretty normal in anything that's not music specific, but he also didn't enjoy sounds like rustling of leaves in the trees. Right? Or the cackling of fire in a fireplace, right? Many people, these are not necessarily musical sounds by kind of most definitions of music, but some people still say they find those sounds to be rewarding and enjoyable to be listen to, and he also did not derive any enjoyment from it. So we're following that up right now, but one thing that we did see was that BW's pattern showed different patterns of brain connectivity between the superior temporal gyrus, which is important for auditory perception, and the nucleus accumbens, which is important, one of the reward centers of the brain. And so based on that, and a few other, and some of the work from the Sartori lab, and a few other labs, Dr. Amy Belfi and I sat down and kind of mapped out the brain regions that we think are important for this auditory to reward circuit. And then this is another of the senior thesis that I supervised by Diana Wang. Some of you might remember her, graduated a couple of years ago. What she went and did was take these anatomical regions that were outlined in this figure and actually translate them into brain space. And then what we could do was use this atlas, we'll call her the Wang atlas. This is what happens if you are an undergrad at Harvard that does work in my lab, you end up having an atlas. That's pretty cool. So we took what we called the Wang atlas, and we looked for functional connectivity patterns from the auditory network and from the reward network, and we mapped its connections to all other areas in the brain. And we did this in 108 older adults that either had Alzheimer's disease or had mild cognitive impairment, which is one of the kind of early stages that might soon predict Alzheimer's disease, and also in age-matched healthy older adult controls. And what we saw was that the patterns of overlapping functional connectivity between healthy older adults and older adults with mild cognitive impairment were very similar, whereas there was an overall reduction in functional connectivity in older adults with Alzheimer's disease. And so for people who are interested in music therapy, right, one finding from that might mean if you're going to start with receptive music-based interventions for people with Alzheimer's disease, it's important to start early like in the mild cognitive impairment stage, so that you can take advantage of the still mostly conserved patterns of functional connectivity between the auditory and the reward systems. The other finding from there was that even folks with Alzheimer's disease have quite some overlap between the auditory system and the reward system, and that is centered around the insula, right? And so in another secondary analysis, Mei-Shan Ai, who is a graduate student in our department, went and did a secondary analysis of functional connectivity in older adults, specifically targeting the insula. And now she then split the insula apart into a more dorsal part versus a more ventral part and a more posterior part. And then specifically, she looked for patterns of functional connectivity that would be correlated, right, or predictive of individual differences in how much you engage with music, right? So that was assessed using the Goldsmith's Music Sophistication Index, which is another kind of common, widely used way to quantify music experience in the field of music cognition. And what we saw was that there were two different pathways that were functionally correlated with the musical score, right? So with how musically trained and how musically engaged you are. The dorsal anterior insula was more functionally connected towards the precentral gyrus, so areas that are important for the motor system, so the more dorsal system that Robert talked about, whereas the ventral anterior insula was more functionally connected to the more ventral areas that you already heard about. So we're looking to do not just resting state functional connectivity, but also task-based functional music listening tasks, right? So we had both young adults, around college-age young adults, and older adults, mostly 65 years old and above, listen to different pieces of music, some of which they self-selected to bring into the MRI scanner, others which we selected for them, and I'll go more into that in a bit. And so they had to listen to these 20-second clips of music, and then they just had to rate how much they liked and were familiar with these pieces of music. So it's a little bit like that music bidding task that Salimpour et al. Pioneered in the Satori lab. And so what we did, what we saw, first of all, was that music that was more loved, more highly rated as more liked and more familiar, were better at engaging the auditory and the reward systems. And the other thing that we saw was that music that you self-selected to listen to, which is presumably also more liked and more familiar, was even better at engaging the reward system. So there seems to be something about just asking you to choose your own music that already is a very effective way of engaging many areas of the brain. And so that's kind of intuition number two for people in music therapy. You can't make people like a piece of music if they don't already like it. Right? So there's something about letting people choose their own music to engage with that seems to be especially good at engaging the many areas of the brain. We also then, as I mentioned, did this in both young adults and older adults. And you can see that for the most part, or even music that you hate, right, is still able to engage the brain. It engages the auditory system, which is not so surprising. But music that you love is even better at engaging many areas of the brain. So not only including the auditory areas, but also including these classic areas of the medial prefrontal cortex that are important for reward and emotion. Okay, so how much time? We have about 10 more minutes. Okay, and the other thing we saw was that if you just isolate areas from the Wang Atlas, right, that was important for, that was a set of regions that we hypothesized to be important for auditory processing and for reward processing, and you compare their activity and functional connectivity between younger adults and older adults, what we saw was that the older adults were less sensitive to reward overall. So the reward areas were less functionally connected with each other, so less correlated with each other. And furthermore, the correlations between the auditory areas and the reward areas was specifically less engaged, less correlated in older adults when listening to music that you love. So there does seem to be something about aging that changes the functional connectivity of the auditory and the reward systems. But so we then went on to ask, right, what is it? Can we do something about that, right? Can listening to music through a music-based intervention actually change the effects of age on music listening? So we then ran a collaborative study. This is working with Suzanne Hanser, who started the music therapy department at Berklee College of Music, so just down the street from us. And then also working with Dr. Maya Geddes, who at the time was at the Harvard Medical School, which is also just down the street from us. So a very Bostonian collaboration. But what we did was we designed an 8-week music-based intervention working with music therapists where every week these older adults listen to music for an hour a day every week, and then they spoke with the music therapist to journal their experiences throughout. So it's a mindful music-based listening program. And before and after that intervention, we ran very different kinds of magnetic resonance imaging and also neuropsychological testing. So we're still analyzing that data, but the first thing that we did was look at the changes in auditory reward connectivity to see whether there was anything that might change as a result of that music-based intervention. And so when we found that when we seeded the auditory areas from the Wang Atlas, right? And then compared the functional connectivity towards every other area in the brain before and after intervention. The only area that changed in its functional connectivity to the auditory system was in the medial prefrontal cortex, which is, of course, part of the reward system. And furthermore, the sensitivity of that same cluster was stronger in self-selected music after intervention compared to other selected music. Right? So there's something about auditory engagement of the reward system which I've just shown changes over the lifespan, but what I'm now showing is enhanced by this mindful music-based listening program. So that's very exciting for those of us who are interested in music therapy. And so far, I've shown you one example of an active music-based intervention for Parkinson's disease, so dancing in time to music. And I've also shown you one example of a receptive music-based intervention, so mindful music listening program for healthy aging. And in all of these cases, we were careful to work with the music therapists. And so I think it is very much an interdisciplinary effort. Who would then the music therapist would then have much more advice on what they think the duration of the intervention is and what they think the intensity of that intervention should be. But that still begs that kind of general scientific question of what makes a good dose of music-based intervention for the brain, right? If you're going to design a music-based intervention from scratch, how much is enough? How much is good? And so I'm kind of inspired by the colleagues that I share a hallway with here at Northeastern University who do exercise interventions, right? And they say something like, the American Academy for Pediatrics recommends 30 minutes of active exercise a day for each child. Right? So what's the musical equivalent of 30 minutes of active exercise a day? I mean, would you say 30 minutes of Mozart? Or that can't be, because not everybody likes Mozart. So is there something that we could do about our knowledge, using our knowledge of the auditory and the reward networks that could be useful for empirically determining the dosage that is needed for music? And of course, I should point out that music is a product of culture, right? It's not only a biological invention, it's also a product of gene culture coevolution, right? So there's no one piece of music that I could make that would automatically engage the reward system in everybody here. Rather, we have to design some way of thinking about music that kind of transcends these cultural boundaries and would be useful for thinking about music independent of cultural background. So how do we do that, right? So I wanted to, I went back to thinking about musical sounds around the world. So musical sounds around the world often are composed according to a musical scale, right? So the Western musical scale and many, many scales around the world are based around the octave, which is a 2-to-1 frequency ratio, right? So some of you play an orchestra, you know that the orchestra tunes to an A. The A is 440 hertz, 440 cycles per second. And so one octave above that is twice that in frequency, so 880 hertz. And within that 2-to-1 frequency ratio, you've got 12 logarithmically even divisions of that ratio. So this is what the equal tempered Western chromatic scale sounds like. Okay, so here is the equal tempered 12-tone logarithmically even Western chromatic scale. It shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Okay, and different cultures use different steps along that scale, right? So the Western diatonic scale, right, it has 7 different steps along that 2-to-1 frequency ratio. So that's shown in these light blue lines. And so just to orient you, right, this is a nice Western sounding, it's actually a French composer trying to sound Spanish. All right, but then different cultures use different steps along that scale. All right, so I am quite familiar with some Chinese traditional music. It's almost Chinese New Year, right? So this is a nice Chinese pentatonic scale. Uses different steps. Here I show that in red. And now I'm going to play you, it's actually the same violinist performing a piece that's using the same instrument, performing a piece that is very distinctly Chinese sounding. Right, so even if you haven't heard that piece before, there's something about its use of scale that's very Chinese, right? Now, in the past few years, we've started using a different scale. So Heinz Bohlen and John Pierce were different engineers that independently asked, well, why should it be based on 2? Why can't it be based on 3? Right, so this is what the Bohlen-Pierce scale, how that got started. So instead of being based on a 2-to-1 frequency ratio, it's based on a 3-to-1 frequency ratio, and it's got 13 logarithmically even divisions of that scale. All right, so it turns out you can compose using this Bohlen-Pierce scale. Here's a piece of music. So this is a piece called Reminiscences by Stephen Yi. I think it's very beautiful because it's clearly unfamiliar, but it still sounds beautiful, right? And what it uses is the 3-to-5-to-7 ratio. So the Bohlen and Pierce independently figured out that if you take 13 logarithmically even divisions of that 3-to-1 frequency ratio, there are some tones that you can choose along the way that approximate low integer ratios when you play them together. And so since Pythagoras, it's been known that if you play in tones that are related to each other in low frequency ratios, they sound more harmonious and more consonant, right? That's where the word symphony comes from. It's like symphonic vibrations, sympathetic vibrations along low integer ratios. And so what we did is try to see how people can learn this Bohlen-Pierce scale. And so a very simple task, we had people listen to a large number of melodies, and then we had them rate how well the last tone fits the preceding melody. So this is known as the Bohlen-Pierce, the probe tone task in music cognition. So you're going to hear a melody followed by a tone. And your job is to rate on the scale of 1 to 7 how well that last tone fit that preceding melody. All right, so you can think about, oh, maybe it's a 3. How many people think it's a 3? 4? Nobody knows. Okay, so that's okay. But because this is a pre-exposure ratings, right? So then if you were a participant in my lab, you would come in and make those ratings, and you would kind of be unsure what you're supposed to be rating. And then you would listen to a bunch of these melodies over the course of about 20 to 30 minutes that have a predetermined frequency profile across the scale. And then you would make those ratings again, and your post-exposure ratings would be more highly correlated with the exposure than the pre-exposure ratings. And if you just plot the correlation between the ratings and the exposure, you would see that there's an increase in correlations after exposure, suggesting that you learned something about that scale by listening to music in that scale. And furthermore, if you partial out using partial correlations, you just remove the effect of that melody that I used to obtain those ratings, the pre-exposure correlations drop to 0, which means that you didn't really know anything about the scale before you came into the lab. But what I wanted to get to is that most of the music that you hear in real world are using real sounds. Right? So here is one sound. Any guesses what instrument that sound comes from? Violin. Violin? No, not the violin. Oboe. Oboe's a good guess. No, it's actually the Western flute. And here, the second sound, that is the pan flute. Pan flute. So the first one was Western flute, and the second one was a pan flute. And so you can already hear that even though they're trying to play the same pitch, they have different acoustic structures. The second one sounds kind of more hollow or more sparse. And so you can actually look at the spectrogram of these sounds, and you can see that the pan flute, because of its closed tube structure, has a more sparse acoustic spectrum. And you can actually then plot the spectrum on the log scale, and you can see how the Western flute has harmonics, right? So a rich set of harmonics that are related in whole integer ratios to the fundamental frequency, whereas the pan flute has a set of overtone structures that emphasize the odd harmonics. So the 3 to 5 to 7 ratio is actually more in the pan flute than in the flute. So 3 to 5 to 7, I already showed you that there's something about the Bohlen-Pierce scale that emphasizes the use of these odd integer ratios. And in fact, that was what Bohlen and Pierce figured out to make the Bohlen-Pierce scale, and that was why it's 13 logarithmically even divisions of the 3 to 1 ratio. So if that's the case, then, if we think that there's something about musical instruments that you've been exposed to throughout your culture, throughout your environment, and that gives you some information about what your musical structure, your musical system should sound like, and that this relationship, like this kind of, gives you something about the cultural knowledge that you develop throughout your life as an individual. There's something about playing the pan flute that should be a better instrument for playing the Bohlen-Pierce scale, just like the Western flute has been useful for playing the Western scale all along. And so we designed some sounds that either had odd harmonics or even harmonics. And so I'm just going to play you those right now. And we just repeated the task where you listen to a melody followed by a tone, and you have to rate how well that tone fits the melody. Okay, and so that's one kind of trial. And the other group got this. So you can hear how there's the same tune, but the timbre is different, right? And so amazingly, what we found was that people who were exposed to the odd harmonic structure were better at learning that Bohlen-Pierce scale, right? Suggesting that there's something about the acoustics of sounds around you that are able to give you a cue towards the musical structure. So the spectral distribution affects your predictions of musical structure. And so what I'm saying is like, it's actually quite exciting, right? So there's no real auditory cognition theory that really predicts this so far, but what I'm saying is that there's something about the odd harmonics that are emphasized in the pan flute that are better for learning the Bohlen-Pierce scale. If that's the case, then there probably is something about the Western flute, right, and its odd and even harmonics that have been helping you learn the Western scale all along. And then is it not too much to guess that maybe there's something about the sounds that you've been exposed to throughout your life, right, such as through speech, such as through your mother's voice, that might then give you some knowledge of the structure of the language and the speech sounds in your world. And so I think that's, I'm really excited to follow that up a little bit more, right? But the melodies that I showed you so far are quite arbitrarily defined, so algorithmically generated, but we wanted to make some music from that scale that actually gets at the reward system. And so Yuan Zhang here was an undergraduate from Northeastern University. He was a composer and composed this melody. And we had people listen to this and a bunch of other melodies that he composed, and we were able to independently manipulate the number of times each person heard each different melody. And sometimes we also, at tests, we also played some melodies that were the same except with a difference in the end. So you guys have you could probably tell that the ending of that last melody was a little bit different from the first time I played it, right? So we were able to independently manipulate what Robert mentioned as theoretical and schematic kinds of expectations. And we had people rate how much they liked and how familiar they found these melodies to be before and after exposure. And so what we saw was that people were very good at showing that they were familiar with the melodies after they heard them. So the more times they heard a specific melody, the more they thought that that melody was familiar, not so surprising. And then if you change the ending of those melodies, they still thought that that melody was familiar, but there was a difference in familiarity ratings between the original and the altered versions. And amazingly, they also liked the melodies that were presented more. So melodies that had been presented more times, they thought they liked more. And then melodies that had that different ending, they still liked more, but there was a difference in liking that was introduced by that prediction error, or that difference in schematic expectation. We then replicated this in a group of people from China based in Beijing Normal University, and we saw that Chinese individuals also showed the effect of presentation and the effect of prediction error. So both kinds of expectations were observed in both cultures. But the people who did not show this similar mapping between prediction and reward were people with musical anhedonia. So the people who scored low on the Barcelona Music Reward Questionnaire had a very different pattern of liking ratings, even though their familiarity ratings were the same. And then finally, what we saw was that the functional connectivity between the auditory areas in the Heschel gyrus and the medial prefrontal cortex, which I've shown you many times now, is part of the reward circuit turned out to show functional connectivity that was the same, similar in pattern as the liking ratings. So suggesting that you really can get form new predictions and map them to reward in the lab setting. So I think this is really the closest we've got to thinking about how dosage can be manipulated in a music-based intervention. So together, I've shown you that the music is useful for tapping into both auditory, motor, and reward system, right? Something that Robert also talked about, and that prediction and reward seem to drive music as an agent for bringing people closer together. And hopefully this work on dosage dependence of this mapping between prediction and reward could be applied for future music-based interventions, and that include receptive and active kinds of interventions. So all this work depends on a lot of collaborations between not just neuroscientists and musicians, but also people who study music for their lives, right? So we're very excited to have curated a set of interdisciplinary essays on music psychology that integrate scientific ways of thinking and humanistic ways of thinking, as well as artistic ways of thinking in hopefully transformative ways. So that's a book that's coming out this year. This is a brand new cover, just been decided, and we're very excited about it. And it's available for pre-order and is published by RIT Press. So you could go to Amazon and order it right now. It's very exciting. So I think I would close. I'm way over time, I know. But thank you for your attention. Thank you to the funding sources, and thank you for the wonderful people who participated in this research. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Psyche. Again, I think there are tons of questions. If there's one burning one we could take. Yes?
If you go back to the pan flute, that sounded really interesting. You were saying the odd intervals are emphasized for pan flute?
That's right. The odd harmonics are emphasized, and that is also the case with blown bottles and also with clarinets. So the closed tube structure emphasizes the odd harmonics.
All right, I think we're a little bit behind, so why don't we take a break now? We'll try and collect you all back in here in about 15 minutes or so, and then we'll get started for the next session.